Projekt Guru.
Всем привет! С вами Zak Novak на радиостанции Novorossia Rocks. Welcome to Novorossia Rocks Radio Station. This is Zak Novak, your American in downtown Donetsk. The program is called Projekt Guru. Guru's in the house as always. Guru, thank you so much for all the hard work you do. Andre, my engineer, awesome. Let's go straight into it. Japan. Thousands of Japanese anti-war protesters took to the streets outside of Parliament today in Tokyo, slamming the new war legislation, which effectively abandons Japan's post-World War II status of pacifism and allows the Japanese military to be deployed abroad, even if situations when Japan is not under direct attack. The legislation, passed in September amidst similar protests, went into effect today, the culmination of the long-standing ambitions of Prime Minister Abe Shinzo to allow Japan to participate in overseas U.S. military operations. Though presented by politicians as merely allowing the military to engage in collective self-defense, though military officials conceded that the law allows their military to do virtually anything under the guise of defense operations. Abe insisted in comments today that the new legislation will prevent wars, claiming rising threats from North Korea and China justify the move. The effort has been loudly backed by the U.S. officials who envision this as giving them another sidekick for their assorted future wars. Andre, listen to this. American citizens more of a threat than immigrants. NYPD Commissioner, our own citizens pose bigger threat to Americans than migrants. New York City Police Commissioner William Bratton on Monday refuted GOP candidates' recent remarks about the dangers of immigrants coming into the U.S. and explained that the biggest threat to Americans comes from the country's own citizens. Speaking to Don Lemon on CNN Monday night, Mr. Bratton said he disagreed with businessman Donald Trump's assessment that America was unsafe because of a surge of Muslims coming into the country. America is a very safe place, Mr. Bratton said, Mediate reported, but we have had our incidences, and we know we had more than our fair share of mass killings, some committed by terrorists, but the vast majority committed by American citizens living here who have access to firearms. The bigger threat at the moment is from our own citizens than from those abroad. He said that the threat may change over time as the world becomes less stable, but said that since 9/11, U.S. law enforcement has put in place significant counterterrorism measures to ensure the safety of Americans. Guru, let's go to Serbia. Serbia is still suffering from depleted uranium used by terrorist organization NATO. The use of depleted uranium during NATO bombing of Serbia has caused long-term damage to Serbia and the Serbian people because every year we have an increase in the number of cancer cases by 25% over the previous year. Figures in the case of patients in Kosovska Mitrovica support this fact, as in 2011 here were registered 185 of them, the following year 225, and in 2013 250. Therefore, the gloomy forecasts imposed back in 2002 that the use of depleted uranium during the aggression of Western military alliance against FRY will cause an epidemic of malignant diseases turned out to be accurate, said Dr. Novorossia Rocks for Serbian Daily. Dr. Srbiak, a cardiologist at the ZTC in Kosovska Mitrovica and founder of the NGO Angel of Mercy, which deals with data on a number of patients with malignancy in Kosovo, explained for the Daily that those who used the depleted uranium had to know what consequences it causes. He said that the study of his organization, which covered a period of 2 years before and 2 years after the bombing, clearly shows that the number of patients with malignant diseases is caused by radioactivity and not stress and other bad life habits. Let us remember the example of Italy, which has revealed that their soldiers who stayed in Kosovo were irradiated and that the increased number of hematological diseases is a direct consequence of the use of depleted uranium ammunition. Italian K4 soldiers were deployed where the most of the ammunition with depleted uranium was used in Peć, Dajkovica, in Kosar. Their families, as far as I know, have received compensation. Dr. Srbiak urges the authorities that our country formally request compensation not only for material damage, but also because of the increase in number of patients with malignant disease. The cardiologist claims that someone was trying to minimize the information he and his team published back in 2002 that the number of patients with malignant diseases was increased by almost 200% compared to the period before the bombing. It became clear that we are right when our neighbors, Albanians, started to go to Belgrade for treatment because, and that is obvious, they have confidence in the expertise of Serbian doctors. I therefore think that our proposal to open a branch of Oncology Institute in Belgrade here in Kosovska Mitrovica could finally be realized. U.S. consulate warning in Turkey for U.S. citizens. The U.S. consulate in Adana, the Incirlik Air Base, and 2 other locations in southern Turkey are all facing orders from the state and defense departments for the families of diplomats and military staff to leave the region. Officials are denying any specific threat, but say that the decision is based on worsening security concerns in Turkey, which is facing a growing number of suicide bombings and other attacks in recent weeks. Families elsewhere in Turkey, including the capital of Ankara and Istanbul, are not affected by the new orders. The State Department said they've been considering the move for several weeks and that the timing had nothing to do with the Turkish officials visiting Washington, D.C. this week, or indeed were timed to anything else. The State Department also issued a statement warning U.S. citizens against travel to southeastern Turkey in general, citing increased threats of terrorism throughout Turkey. Southeastern Turkey is where the Turkish military is fighting Kurdish secessionists. Let me bring in my lovely co-host Natalia, bringing you more news from Novorossia and around the world.
Military sitrep, shelling of Gorlovka, Sakhanka, Kominternova and Yasinovate. Ukrainian fighters shelled Yasinovate checkpoint by heavy armament. Subdivisions of Ukrainian armed forces shelled village Mineralnaya close to Yasinovate, having used artillery weaponry of 152mm caliber. It was reported to done by the representative of the Defense Ministry. Mineralnaya was shelled last evening by heavy artillery. 13 shells of 152mm caliber landed there, it was specified. It was added that the city Yasinovate was shelled also. 12 mines of 120mm caliber were launched at it. Ukrainian fighters used also infantry combat vehicle. Kiev armed formations launched nearly 30 mines at northern suburbs of Gorlovka and Donetsk. Subdivisions of Ukrainian armed forces launched 27 mines at northern suburbs of Gorlovka and Donetsk. The shelling of Zaitseva started at 10 p.m. At 11 p.m. they started shelling Veselaya and Zhabicheva. In regard to the data of the DPR Defense Ministry, the hostility carried out shelling from positions in Peski. Village Sakhanka and Kominternova in the south of Donbass were attacked again. Villages in the south of the DPR as Sakhanka and Kominternova were shelled last night. Ukrainian forces started shelling Sakhanka at 10:30 p.m. The enemy launched at least 10 mines of 82 and 120mm caliber. Kominternova was subjected to shelling at 4 a.m. this morning. Ukrainian fighters used mortars of 82 and 120mm caliber, 4 mines of 120mm caliber and 5 mines of 82mm caliber landed in the village.
Guru, we got some major news coming out of Yemen. Children starving and getting killed by U.S. and Saudi coalition airstrikes in Yemen. 6 children have been killed or maimed daily in Yemen since U.S.-Saudi airstrikes began a year ago, the UN said Tuesday, warning the conflict was taking a horrifying toll on the country's youth. In a report marking the anniversary of the start of the U.S.-Saudi campaign, the UN Children's Agency said nearly a third of more than 3,000 civilians killed in Yemen were children. Children are not safe anywhere in Yemen. Even playing or sleeping has become dangerous. The Saudi-led intervention in support of President Abdrado Mansour Hadi began on March 26 last year, but has yet to deal a decisive blow to the Houthi rebels and their allies, who still control Sana'a and key parts of the country. Hopes for a breakthrough in the conflict emerged last week when the warring sides agreed on a ceasefire to be observed before peace talks on April 18th. A halt to the violence is sorely needed in what before the escalation of the conflict was already one of the world's poorest nations. The UN estimates 82% of the population is now in desperate need of humanitarian aid, with 320,000 children considered severely malnourished. The scale of suffering in the country is staggering, Tuesday's report said, providing a heart-wrenching testimony from children caught up in the violence. In addition to thousands of children who have been direct victims of the violence and hurt in the most extreme and cruel ways, Tuesday's report showed even more suffering, the secondary effects of the fighting. Basic services and infrastructure in Yemen are on the verge of total collapse. UNICEF estimates that close to 10,000 children under 5 may have died over the past year alone from preventable diseases as a result of decline in access to vaccines and other key health services. This comes on top of nearly 50,000 children who die every year in Yemen before their 5th birthday. The UN says 63 healthcare facilities have been attacked over the past year and 3 have been occupied for military purposes. Children, desperate for a sense of normalcy amid the physical and emotional violence they're experiencing, are also often cut off from attending school, which provides a compass point. There had been more than 50 direct attacks on schools and teachers, and some 50 schools have been occupied by fighters, UNICEF said. Guru, this is just heart-wrenching. I can't, I'm just reading this stuff. Obama, what is in your mind? What are you trying to do? More than 1,600 schools, meanwhile, remain closed due to insecurity, infrastructure damage, or because they are being used to house some 2.4 million people have been displaced by the conflict. Many children are also being forced to take part in the violence surrounding them. UNICEF said it documented 848 cases of children being recruited by different sides of the conflict, with reports indicating children as young as 10 were forced to take part in the fighting. Tragic as it is, these statistics are the only tip of the iceberg, the report said, adding that the actual numbers were likely much higher. Guru Andre, more madness from Yemen, children starving. A new report from UNICEF marking the 1-year anniversary of the Saudi-U.S. war coalition against Yemen details the massive toll the war and the ongoing naval blockade of Yemen is inflicting on Yemeni children. The report estimates some 320,000 children are facing severe, life-threatening malnutrition, and that some 82% of the Yemeni population is reliant on humanitarian aid at this point. Before the war, Yemen imported some 90% of its food from abroad. Though the Saudi-U.S.-led naval blockade, which the U.S. has participated in, was nominally meant to prevent weapons shipments to the country, protracted delays for all ships trying to make deliveries has shipping companies avoiding taking Yemen-bound jobs. Though the UN eventually started scaling up humanitarian shipments to Yemen after the war began, the Saudis have ensured that those shipments are predominantly to Saudi-held territory, with the Shiite regions getting little support. Last news of the day, and just like our hero, revolutionary hero Fidel Castro, his speech, this is going to be a little long for you, my folks. Hey, Obama, we don't need you or your presence. This from revolutionary hero Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro responded Monday to President Barack Obama's historic trip to Cuba with a long, bristling letter recounting the history of U.S. aggression against Cuba, writing that we don't need the empire to give us any presence. The 1,500-word letter in state media titled Brother Obama was Castro's first response to the president's 3-day visit last week, in which the American president said he had come to bury the 2 centuries history of Cold War hostility. Obama did not meet with the 89-year-old Fidel Castro on the trip, but met several times with his 84-year-old brother, Raul Castro, the current Cuban president. Obama's visit last week was intended to build irreversible momentum behind his opening with Cuba and to convince the Cuban people and the Cuban government that a half a century of U.S. attempts to overthrow the communist government had ended, allowing Cuba to reform its economy and political system more quickly. Fidel Castro writes to Obama, "My modest suggestion is that he reflects and doesn't try to develop theories about Cuban politics." Castro, who led Cuba for decades before handling power to his brother in 2008, was legendary for his hours-long, all-encompassing speeches. His letter contrasts sharply with Obama's tightly focused speech in Havana last week. Castro's letter opens with descriptions of environmental abuse, presenting a sharp contrast to the Spaniards, and reviews the historical roles of Cuban independence heroes José Martí, Antonio Maceo, and Máximo Gómez. Castro goes over crucial sections of Obama's speech line by line, engaging in the ex-post facto dialogue with the American president with pointed critiques of perceived slights and insults, including Obama's failure to give credit to indigenous Cubans and Castro's prohibition of racial segregation after coming to power in 1959. Quoting Obama's declaration that it is time now for us to leave the past behind, the man who shaped Cuba during the second half of the 20th century writes that, "I imagine that any one of us ran the risk of having a heart attack on hearing these words from the President of the United States." Castro then returns to review half a century of U.S. aggression against Cuba. Those events include the decades-long U.S. trade embargo against the island, the 1961 Bay of Pigs attack, and the 1976 bombing of a Cuban airliner backed by exiles who took refuge in the U.S. He ends with a dig at Obama administration's drive to increase business ties with Cuba. The Obama administration says reestablishing economic ties with the U.S. will be a boon for Cuba, whose centrally planned economy has struggled to escape from over-dependence on imports and a chronic shortage of hard currency. The focus on U.S.-Cuba business ties appears to have particularly rankled Castro, who nationalized U.S. companies after coming to power in '59 and establishing the communist system into which his brother is now introducing gradual market-based reforms. No one should pretend that the people of the noble and selfless country will renounce its glory and its rights, Fidel Castro wrote. We are capable of producing the food and material wealth that we need with the work and intelligence of our people. Viva Cuba! Viva Fidel Castro! Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody stay safe, be on alert, and see you all on Friday. Bye-bye folks.